For more than 4 decades, one of Australia's most prolific serial killers, Peter Norris Jupass, preyed on the women of Victoria.
He's driven by dark demons and compulsions we can't even imagine.
This guy is pure evil. His eyes, his demeanour, the way he planned it all.
By 2010, 3 innocent women lay dead at his hands in the most macabre killings the country had ever seen.
She had been stabbed multiple times. She was semi-naked.
Developing sadistic rituals that would stun the nation.
It's the first murder I'd attended and was something I hadn't seen before, there being post-mortem mutilations.
But for years he would evade the necessary justice for his crimes.
He can rot in hell, that's all I want to say.
Only to be finally brought down in one of Australia's most sensational trials, involving a jailhouse confession and $1 million reward, making this a crime that shook Australia. Peter Norris Jupass began his reign of terror over 40 years ago, when he was still just a boy.
Jupass first came to police attention as a 15-year-old, where he attacked his neighbour.
Attempting to stab his victim with a kitchen knife, this terrifying method would become a chilling part of his sexual attacks for many years to come, culminating in 3 innocent women meeting a horrific fate.
You are a psychopath driven by the hatred of women.
When 28-year-old Nikki Patterson failed to meet her friend one evening, nobody could have predicted the horror that was to unfold.
The original job had been called in as a suicide by a girlfriend of Nikki Patterson who turned up to go out for dinner with Nikki. So it had been called in as a suicide, but when the van crew attended and also the local detectives, it became very evident to them that it wasn't a suicide and that Nikki had been murdered and also mutilated.
Police sealed off Harper Street just after 7 o'clock last night when a friend of Nicole Amanda Patterson found her body slumped inside the Northcote house.
A trained psychotherapist and counsellor, Nikki Patterson lived in Northcote, Melbourne.
There's a lot of aspects of Nikki. I guess firstly she was a rogue. She was a bit of a rascal growing up, and she just loved life and loved people. Nikki was at I think, the perfect point in her life. She discovered what she wanted to do and who she was. Prior to that, I think she was trying a number of aspects and found exactly where she wanted to head.
Nikki was keen to choose a career that involved helping other people.
She then joined Ardoc Youth Foundation, which was making sure that underprivileged children received an education. And part of that was housing and, if necessary, and clothing and food. She wanted to utilise her psychotherapy qualification and start helping people with counselling. So she cut down to a 7-day fortnight.
Nikki took the decision to set up her own business with a view to building her clients. As a first step, she placed an advert in a local newspaper.
We'll speak to the family. We started to get the picture together, in fact, that she had just started a career as a psychotherapist, and that would appear to be the first day.
Confronted with a scene of carnage in Nikki's home, officers began their investigations into what could have happened and were quickly given telling clues.
When we started to do the door knocks in the area, it became quite evident that something had occurred that morning. There are a number of witnesses indicated that they'd heard arguments, loud arguments and screaming of a female, but thought it was just a domestic dispute. They sort of gave us a bit of a timeline in relation to what we thought might have occurred. That sort of started our point of reference, and then from there we started to piece everything together.
The murder scene was to hold vital clues for Jeff Maher and his team.
She had been stabbed multiple times. She was semi-naked. She'd been mutilated. And it was obvious to us that there was a sense of some sort of formal meeting of someone because of the tray and the coffee and the plunger and the jug of milk. And the room at the front of the house was set up like a consulting room or some sort of professional room.
Having established her new business from home, it looked like Nikki was preparing for a client when tragedy struck.
We determined we thought that it was in fact probably a client of hers, and that was indication by the relatives. We looked at all the evidence at the time in the house, and we were drawn towards a diary, and in that diary was the word Malcolm and a mobile or a cell phone number.
This diary entry and telephone number were now a major part of the investigation. Who was Malcolm, and what connection did he have to Nikki Patterson?
It was actually owned by an Indian student. He was alibied, and in fact he couldn't give us and help us anymore. So we made some inquiries in relation to the phone numbers that had been ringing Nikki Patterson's house, and we were able to show that in fact another phone number had rung the house, and that phone number was of Peter Jupass.
Peter Jupass was a 46-year-old local man who lived in Pascoe Vale. Checks were quickly made to discover if he had any previous dealings with police.
We did a profile on Peter Jupass, and we discovered that in fact that he was a serial violent predator against women.
The telephone number at Jupass's address had called Nikki's home 15 times over 40 days. Officers wasted no time in tracking him down for questioning.
We decided that we had enough to arrest him. We grabbed him and he was interviewed, and we noticed that on his face was a scratch, and the scratch seemed to us that it looked like it possibly come from a human nail or striking of a nail down a face.
Nikki had met a violent and horrific death. The scratch may have looked suspicious, but the detectives needed more.
We asked him whether he knows Nikki Patterson, whether he in fact had ever been to Harper Street in Northcote, had he ever contacted Nikki Patterson, and there was a negative response to all those questions. He appeared calm. He appeared sort of, I'll describe him as a bit of a Poindexter, a bit of a blancmange, a bit of a beige sort of person that seemed to be emotionless.
With little cooperation from Jupass, Jeff and his team rushed to search his home and were confronted with startling evidence.
As we walked into the yard, we saw that the garden hose of the house had been repaired with yellow electrical tape. Now, the relevance of that was because there was small amounts of yellow electrical tape found at the scene in and upon Nikki Patterson's body. So it was very relevant to us.
In the rubbish bin at Peter Jupass's home address, when we executed the search warrant, there was a small piece of paper that had been torn up and found at the bottom of his bin, and putting it back together, it actually had Nikki's details and the appointment time and location on the bit of paper.
And it had the word Malcolm written on it, and that was the word and the name of the person that was next to that mobile phone number in her diary for that Monday morning at about 9 o'clock.
Down the bottom of the bin was also a pair of shoes which had blood on the shoes.
We found a kit, we'd call it, with a balaclava and some gloves and some condoms. And then further to that, we also then found a jacket, what you describe as a trucker's jacket, and it had what appeared to us to be blood on the jacket. We further found a newspaper under the sink that had a cut through the face of Nikki Patterson, which was a headline that she'd been brutally murdered.
Within just 3 days of Nikki's violent death, Victoria Police arrested and charged Dupas with her murder.
He gave an alibi at the time that he just sort of filled the vehicle up, he pottered around, did a few odd jobs, and his girlfriend was away at the time and he didn't attend work that day, so he really didn't have an alibi.
Whatever alibi Jupass was to provide, the scientific evidence was to prove overwhelming.
The jacket was important because on the jacket there was a DNA profile of not only Nikki Patterson on the jacket, but also of Peter Jupass, and a combination. We discovered afterward as well, when we collected all the CCTV in the area, that in fact that morning, before he murdered Nikki Patterson, he filled his motor vehicle up with fuel at a local service station, and on the CCTV you see him paying for the fuel in that green jacket.
The evidence against this vicious predator was now compelling. After a trial lasting 4 weeks, the verdict came through.
Peter was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, which was a great relief to the police and the family who were there every day throughout the trial and remained very strong.
I suppose I felt relief when they caught him. I think I was too shocked to feel anger. I was sort of more saying, he's stolen her, he's a thief, he's stolen my daughter. My family's not whole anymore. They have got the right person, and I wasn't ever in doubt that they didn't have. Or they just have him off the street, and that he would be punished for the rest of his life.
Peter Jupass was behind bars, but the tragic murder of Nikki Patterson was just the beginning of an insight into this killer's reign of terror. What was to follow would stun the nation.
Jupass, to us, was a violent sexual predator against women. It was quite obvious to us that Nikki Patterson's murder wasn't his first.
Nikki Patterson has met a brutal and violent death in her home at the hands of sadistic murderer Peter Norris Jupass. Having been stabbed 27 times, the killer removed her breasts in an act of utter barbarity. In being handed a life sentence, the nation was to learn the chilling history of this remorseless murderer.
When we started to probe around in relation to who he was, there was a substantial police file on him.
This police file dated right the way back to the early 1970s, almost 30 years before Nikki's death.
I was at Nunawading CIB and we got a call to attend a place in Mitcham where there was a complaint of a woman who'd been raped. She was at home when I knocked at the door, and she answered to see this person who said his car had broken down, and perhaps if he could have the end of a screwdriver that he might be able to fix it. She went off to get the screwdriver, and he came in and grabbed her around the neck.
Just days later, the attacker struck again, nearby.
This particular one, he'd gone to the front door and used exactly the same scenario. That my car's broken down, the bonnet was up again, could I have a screwdriver? The woman there was perhaps a little bit more suspicious. She said to him, well, my husband's coming home shortly, perhaps if you wait he can help you fix the car. And with that, of course, he said, don't worry about it, it'll be right, sort of thing. And he left immediately, over to his car, closed the bonnet, drove off. She got the car number.
With a pattern emerging, a description of a man and a car to go off, Ian Armstrong closed in on a suspect, 21-year-old Peter Jupass.
He had his hands clenched together and he'd sort of be looking down as though trembling, and I thought, this guy's going to crack, you know. He looked as though he was just about on the verge of saying, okay, you got me, sort of thing. And then he'd just sort of look up and, no, I don't know what you're saying. Not me, I wasn't there. It was as though his whole persona changed, and which was quite strange. I'd never come across a person like this. I thought to myself, this guy's different. He's very much different to anybody I'd encountered.
Despite Dupass's denial, his victim successfully identified him in a lineup. A turning point that would see Dupass put behind bars for the first time.
He ended up being convicted of the offence and being sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. I said that the cold calculating way he went about it, the eyes, everything, it all rolled into onto me saying this guy is evil, and in my opinion has the ability, especially where females are concerned, to go all the way and to kill.
A chilling warning from a detective decades before that was to sadly come true. A young Peter Dupas first went to prison in 1974, 25 years before the murder of Nikki Patterson. On his release, he committed 4 attacks on separate women over 10 days in 1979, 3 further assaults in 1980, another rape just 4 days after release in 1985, and the false imprisonment of a woman in 1994.
What we're able to establish by looking into his criminal history is he was a man who was a repeat offender, showed no remorse, and I suspect couldn't even help himself.
Shockingly, despite a lifetime behind bars for killing Nikki Patterson, Australia would be plagued by Dupass's heinous crimes for years to come, as more information started to come to light.
We started to investigate previous murders that maybe he fitted the bill with, and that's why a task force was formed. Paul Scarlett went to the task force and they investigated the murder of Margaret Maher.
Margaret Maher had been murdered in 1997 and her case remained unsolved.
Homicide detectives are investigating the discovery of a woman's body in Somerton.
Margaret lived in the Campbellfield area and was well known for plying her trade as a prostitute. She was described as a fairly harmless woman who was only working enough for the purpose of being able to supply a drug addiction. She was well liked in the area, being that she was just a softly spoken, very quiet lady, and would often be seen at the shopping centre just walking around the shops, selecting items off the shelf and then putting them back. I think that was Margaret's way of just some degree of normalcy in her life, and then from there she would go out and continue to work.
40-year-old Margaret Maher's life took a turn for the worse as she entered her adult years.
Margaret came from a very successful family, a very close-knit family. Margaret was certainly a character as a teenager, and in her later years started to run into a little bit of bad luck, mainly because of the people she was associating with at the time.
Margaret worked the streets to feed her drug addiction, and in 1997, tragedy struck.
Margaret's body was located in Somerton at about 6:30 in the morning by a man and his wife who were collecting cans to raise funds for a charity, I believe. And he saw the pile of computer components and boxes lying in that area and lifted one of them and found Margaret's body underneath.
Margaret had been choked to death, mutilated, and had one of her breasts removed. But despite many police hours, the investigation into her horrific murder ran cold.
There was no new information coming forward, and the difficulty was because of Margaret's past behaviour and her lifestyle. She was a prostitute, she was a drug user, her health was not good, she had some issues health-wise. So the investigators initially couldn't take it anywhere, and the investigation was filed.
But more than 7 years on from her murder, officers would uncover a terrifying link to Nikki Patterson that would blow the case wide open again.
There were only 2 murders recorded in Australia in the last 10 years where breasts had been removed post-mortem, and that was Nikki Patterson, which Peter had already been convicted for, and Margaret Maher.
The brutal murder of Margaret Maher in October 1997 devastated her family and puzzled the police. With few witnesses and little to go off at the scene, the trail for the killer ran cold. Yet years later, with the violent death of another woman, Nikki Patterson, officers would find themselves back on the hunt for Margaret's killer after a chilling discovery that linked both women.
The injuries sustained to her were very similar to Nikki. In fact, so similar, when we started to review that investigation, we went to the Homicide Monitoring Unit in Canberra, and I gave them parameters of searching murders nationally, and I think the figures were up around the 2 in 10,000 murders nationally that had similar wounds inflicted.
The 2 in 10,000 were Nikki and Margaret. This bizarre mutilation had only happened to these 2 women. It was so rare, it led only to one man, Peter Jupass. But detectives needed to build the case further.
When Margaret's body was located, there were a number of boxes and computer components that were tipped on top of the body. So obviously a lot of that was re-examined, and there was also a female's glove located nearby, and that was tested back in 1997 with the technology that was available then, and we had that glove retested in 2001, and at that time the scientists lifted DNA from inside one of the finger holes of the glove.
This DNA was a massive breakthrough and matched with their prime suspect, Jupass. The chances of it belonging to anyone else were 1 in 450,000.
We used the DNA evidence and similar fact evidence to complete a brief of evidence against Peter Jupass.
Our argument was that the person that did this was one and the same person as the person that had murdered Nikki Patterson, because we said he had a signature, that is the removal of the breast, or breasts in the case of Nikki Patterson. You need an unusual feature or an underlying methodology or practice, and we had that.
The argument against Jupass appeared to be mounting, but in opening the case once more, it also reopened wounds for Nikki Patterson's family.
We had to suspend Margaret's trial and effectively reopen Nicole's murder trial and prove that murder to this jury.
It was extremely hard, the Margaret Maher trial. During the trial for Nikki, I was in too much shock, and I sat out on a lot of the parts that were going to be too hard. But this time I sat there and made most of it. There was one instance where they showed video of Nikki in her lounge room, and when they panned around onto her face and her eyes were open, I just walked straight out. You know, it was pretty horrific.
The eventual trial for the murder of Margaret Maher was heard 7 years after her death. Despite the evidence against him, Jupass still mounted a defence.
The defence mentioned that breast mutilation or genital mutilation was a common event during the Vietnam War and with Jack the Ripper. So their defence was that it was not an unusual event and shouldn't be considered as a unique set of circumstances here in Australia.
After a highly charged trial lasting 3 weeks, the verdict came through.
Peter Jupass was again sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for the murder of Margaret Maher. We felt relieved for the family.
Dupas was now known as one of Australia's most barbaric killers. His depravity held no bounds, taking one of Nikki's body parts after his chilling attack and leaving Margaret with her breast forced into her mouth. With his crimes recorded from the age of just 15, his macabre attacks had escalated over the years, culminating in 2 horrific murders. With such a history, could there be more victims?
Well, it was All Saints' Day, and Msina had gone out in her boyfriend's car to the cemetery to tend to her grandmother's grave.
Msina Halvaris was a 25-year-old bank worker who lived in Mentone with her parents.
Msina was a lovely young girl who lived a very, I'd say, modest life, very respectful young girl.
On the afternoon of Saturday, the 1st of November, Msina took the decision to go to Forkner Cemetery, a vast graveyard in the suburbs of Melbourne. Having bought flowers nearby, she made her way to the Greek Orthodox section.
A slightly built, fragile woman tending her grandmother's grave and, doing the right thing, doing the family responsibility and doing the right and the moral thing.
As Msina knelt down to tend to her grandmother's grave, the unthinkable happened.
She was attacked viciously and repeatedly near the grave, murdered, dragged up into an area between 2 graves and left there. Msina had been reported missing by her boyfriend and her father, and eventually the trail led back to the cemetery where the vehicle's located, the boyfriend's vehicle was located, and the scene was discovered.
When she failed to return in her fiancé's car, he and his father went to investigate and found the vehicle still parked at the cemetery.
Msina sustained a brutal and frenzied attack, suffering more than 80 stab wounds throughout her body. With such a violent and what appeared to be senseless attack, news quickly spread throughout the community as police tried to catch her murderer.
So far, there are no clues to the motive for the killing.
And we're not discounting the fact that it was a random attack.
There was huge media interest because of the circumstances and the style of murder. We had to track whether or not there was anything in the background of Msina that could take us down a path of issues specifically relating to her, and that wasn't the case.
Before long, information started to flood in.
On the days leading up to the murder, we had a number of women that made statements in relation to being approached by a person, and it showed that he was in the cemetery and stalking these women. I was lucky that they weren't victims of the particular crime that unfortunately fell upon Msina.
During that first period at the crime scene, a lady came forward and provided a face-fit identification diagram. We had it, but it didn't take us any further.
The lady, Mrs. Berman, mentioned a man she had spoken to in the cemetery on the same day as the murder. Acting strangely, she made a note of what he looked like and what he wore, but officers needed more. Over the coming months, Victoria Police would gather over 1,000 statements and interview anybody who might help with their investigation. But this was all to be to no avail.
Our investigations kept going on that, but we weren't having any breakthrough.
This frustration, coupled with no forensic evidence for Greg and his team to go off, meant they were no closer to finding out who had attacked Msina and why. Seven years on from Msina's murder, Paul Scarlett and his colleagues had just put the killer of Margaret Maher behind bars.
We then commenced looking into Msina's case, try and open up other avenues of inquiry which hadn't yet been explored or properly developed. There were hundreds of information reports created by people trying to assist police. Many exhibits were taken from the Forkner cemetery: cigarette butts, tyre impressions, prints, samples, witnesses being spoken to, recanvassed, door knocks conducted, media releases.
The hunt for Msina's killer was once again a major focus for Victoria Police, with the government even stepping in with one of the highest rewards ever offered in the country.
In February 2005, the Victorian government released a $1 million reward for any information leading to the capture and conviction of the person or persons responsible for the murder.
This massive financial commitment was pushed with the determination of Msina's family, especially her father, George.
Originally there was a $50,000 reward offered in the case of her murder, but George turned himself into a one-man lobby group, and he went to the government and he got 100,000 and finally, ultimately, $1 million.
With the case now firmly back in the public conscience, the investigation was to take a surprising turn.
There was a turning point when the reward money was released as a result of a couple of witnesses coming forward. That, and also making contact with a man called Andrew Fraser.
Andrew Fraser was the underworld's lawyer of choice for many years. He was a hard man for hard jobs.
Andrew Fraser, who was a disgraced lawyer at the time, doing time for drug trafficking, and he had in fact done time with and being in prison with Peter Jupass.
Andrew Fraser was on my list of people to contact, and I left him till last because I really didn't think I'd get any joy. But to my surprise, when I did contact him, he said, "You better come and see me."
One of Australia's most dangerous men, Peter Norris Jupass, is serving 2 life sentences for the murder and mutilation of Nikki Patterson and Margaret Maher. But other questions still remain unanswered. After 7 years, the investigation into the horrific murder of Msina Halvaris had stalled, until a new lead came from somewhere they could never have expected.
Andrew Fraser was one of Australia's top criminal defence lawyers, but convicted of smuggling cocaine, found himself face to face with Dupas in prison.
Andrew Fraser was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment, and that's where Peter Jupass was being housed at that time. Andrew made contact with Peter, particularly Peter, because he was the one that he feared the most, and he wanted to have Peter on side.
Fraser obviously had something to say. Could he provide the missing link officers had been searching for?
I left Melbourne that night and spoke to Andrew Fraser in person at the prison the very next morning.
Paul Scarlett could never have imagined what was to follow.
Andrew alleges that there was one occasion when he and Peter were walking around the garden area of the prison, and a prisoner from another area approached the cyclone fence and yelled obscenities to Peter, saying, "You killed my cousin, Msina." And Peter's responded in a rather colourful way, and then turned around to Fraser and said, "How does that so-and-so know what I've done?" When they were in the garden working, and Fraser has allegedly dug up a knife or a shiv, in the garden area and shown it to Peter, and Peter has held the knife in his hands, almost balanced the knife in his hands and mentioned the word Msina, or the name Msina, on a couple of occasions, and has then got rid of the knife. In one particular meeting that Andrew Fraser had with Peter, he was discussing the prosecution case, or the brief that I had served on him in jail for the murder of Margaret Maher. And Fraser argued with Jupass about the DNA that police had found inside the glove, and Fraser said, "You told me there was no DNA left at the scene." And they then got onto the discussion about Msina Halvaris' crime scene, and Jupass responded by saying, "I left no DNA at that scene."
Andrew Fraser was providing the police with explosive information, and more was to come.
Fraser spent a significant time with Peter in his cell talking about general matters, and on one occasion when they were watching television, George Halvaris was making a public plea for Jupass to talk to police, and on this occasion Jupass clamped both of his hands together and started staring into space, rocking backwards and forwards, and Fraser asked him what was wrong, and Jupass then turned off the television.
He actually mimed the murder, showing himself creeping up on somebody and stabbing them in a way that only the police would know was actually right.
This flood of new information could have been the turning point officers desperately needed. It had been 8 years since Msina's death and had cost thousands of man-hours. Now they were potentially one step closer to connecting Jupass to the murder.
I was absolutely relieved to get that information from Andrew Fraser, and I knew that that's all we needed to go to court. We had enough.
But the offer of this priceless information came with a condition.
Andrew agreed to give this information as evidence in court only on the condition that he was released from prison. I did what's called a petition of mercy to the state government to try and get Andrew Fraser out of prison so that I could commence the trial for Msina Halvaris.
It took Scarlett over a year to get Fraser out of prison. But once he was a free man, it was time to go to court.
Andrew Fraser was released from prison at about 5:30 one particular morning, and by 10 o'clock that morning I was charging Jupass with murder. Can you tell me please your full name and address?
Peter Norris, Jupass, Bowen Prison.
Peter was surprised to see me, but just made a no comment interview and wouldn't cooperate. I put it to you that Msina was stabbed to death whilst tending to the Forkner cemetery in Melbourne. Do you know the incident that I'm talking about? Okay.
Paul and I spoke to George Halvaris and the family about it, that we were in fact charging Jupass with the murder. It was a pretty good day for the Halvaris family and a pretty good day for us.
One of the most highly anticipated trials in Australian criminal history was to get underway at the Supreme Court in Melbourne, and Andrew Fraser was to be one of the key witnesses.
I did everything I could to corroborate the information that Andrew Fraser gave to me through prison records of including prisoner movement, and I was able to do that to a degree, but the pantomime, obviously I'm never going to be able to prove that to a court.
In July 2007, a packed court heard the evidence presented by Andrew Fraser as he acted out what Jupass had done in prison, or the pantomime. Other crucial witnesses also took to the stand.
Mrs. Berman made a photo fit. We were challenged that it was made up, but bearing in mind that Mrs. Berman made that face identification in early 1998, and we didn't get those photos of Peter Jupass into our possession until April 1999. So there's absolutely no way that the allegations put to us could have ever occurred.
Another vital part of the jigsaw was now available. Jupass's jacket, found with Nikki's blood on, matched a description Mrs. Berman had given in the cemetery years before, strongly suggesting he wore it during both murders. The defense for Jupass questioned the evidence, even arguing that Msina's fiancé could have harmed her. All the while, the killer, now in court for a third murder, sat giving nothing away.
Jupass always has the same attitude in court. He will just sit there silent, staring straight ahead. Occasionally he will glare at somebody.
After a tense 22-day trial, the verdict was announced.
He was convicted. He received life no minimum for the murder of Msina.
It was just a great sense of relief for the Halvaris family and the Patterson family that were there every day with the Halvarises. Just a great sense of relief.
I think just being there and for them knowing that I understand how they feel. Well, I don't think I ever will understand, because I had 3 days of not knowing. They had 10 years before it went to trial.
Jupass had finally been handed the justice he had long deserved. But this victory was to be short-lived.
Jupass appealed the conviction on the basis of reliability and credibility of witnesses that had identified Jupass from the front pages of the local newspapers, and also the defence raised the issue that they didn't believe Jupass could ever get a fair trial because of the media notoriety of his crimes and his history, criminal history.
To many people's disbelief, the appeal was upheld. This devastating blow meant the guilty verdict for Msina's murder was quashed.
Just devastated, that's it.
A decision that shocked the nation. A retrial was ordered, meaning police, family and witnesses had to endure the legal process once more.
With the first Msina Halvaris trial, I was not involved in the prosecution of that. But essentially, in the second prosecution, we relied on the same evidence, in the main.
The witnesses once again took to the stand, along with Andrew Fraser, who recounted what Jupass had done in prison.
He's jumped up and gone like that, pointing at the wall, and I'm sitting here, so he's turned around, and then he indicated himself, and then he started the flailing motion as if stabbing somebody.
The retrial lasted 26 days.
He was convicted again, and he appealed. That appeal was knocked back. Jupass will now spend the rest of his days in jail, where he belongs.
Family were very much looking forward to spending their Christmas together for the first time since Msina's tragic death, with this issue now behind them.
Andrew Fraser has now received some of the $1 million reward.
Quite frankly, he deserves it because the Director of Public Prosecution said that without him, there would have been no trial and therefore no conviction.
The infamous reign of terror by Peter Norris Dupas has spanned 4 decades, cost thousands of police hours and much heartache for victims and their families. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars.
The judge said the question remained of how did Jupass come to be how he is. His actions were not explained by mental illness, drugs, childhood or other trauma, but driven by a deep-seated hatred of women.
But despite some closure for Nikki, Margaret and Msina's families, it isn't the end.
We believe he's suspect in a number of other murders going back to the early 80s. Helen McMahon at the Rye Back Beach in the 80s was murdered, and we believe he's a person of interest in that. The Kathleen Downs murder at a nursing home at Brunswick, and also the murder of Renita Brunton, who was killed in a clothing store in Sunbury.
Peter Jupass is the criminal who won't go away.
I've seen a lot of homicides and charged a lot of offenders, but can I tell you that Jupass is a very, very evil person.
I'm no expert on the conscience of Peter Jupass, but I suspect he hasn't got one. Will he ever confess? I suspect not.
You can't even get any sense of what's going on in his head. The corners of evil in his mind are just beyond comprehension.
He's driven by things he doesn't even understand. So he's in jail to punish him? Not really. It won't stop him. It's to protect us.
On the 28th of April 1996, the historic tourist site of Port Arthur in Tasmania became the scene of the largest massacre ever to hit Australia.
Aussie officials are calling it the worst massacre in over 100 years.
There was one body on the doorstep, obviously shot, blood pouring out of him.
Within minutes, a gunman rampaged through the site, shooting at innocent people.
I've not seen injuries like that. There is such destruction from this sort of weapon.
The mother was carrying the 3-year-old baby when they were both shot.
The scale of the deaths and injuries that was to follow rocked the world.
Those scenes were simply horrific, and I have an extraordinary amount of admiration for everybody that had to confront those scenes on the day.
35 people were shot and killed, and 23 wounded.
I've never been involved in war, but I could think of nothing that would describe an incident such as that inside this place as the product of war.
I felt when I left Port Arthur that I had to do something.
The devastation wreaked by the mass murderer and the colossal change the tragedy provoked makes this a crime that shook Australia.
I was working. I started at 9 that morning because there wasn't many staff on. It was a really busy day.
The picturesque tourist site of Port Arthur sits on the Tasman Peninsula, an integral part of Australian history, ever since the British convicts were first shipped there in the 18th century.
Back in those days, the equivalent of Guantanamo Bay. It was a military reserve. You weren't allowed on the peninsula unless you had business there. It was run by the soldiers and Governor Arthur.
The historic site is relatively beautiful in the sense that much of it still survives. Some of it's been restored. So it has that interesting combinations of trees and plants that you would find in the United Kingdom that of course are not native in Tasmania. Port Arthur is always on the list of places to go with anybody that visits us.
On the morning of the 28th of April 1996, Ian Kingston, along with 30 staff at Port Arthur, were preparing to welcome many tourists.
There was a lot of the management side of the organisation were at a seminar on the east coast of Tasmania, Bishano. And it's how come I ended up here on the day. It became obvious by about 11 that it was going to be more busier than what they predicted. I think we had 14 coaches end up coming in. Car parking was getting a bit of an issue because visitor centres there now wasn't there in those days. Everyone used to park under the oak trees and, you know, it was really limited.
One of the tourists visiting the site that day was Peter Crosswell.
At the time I was the state manager of an organisation called Can Quality. It was a support program for kids with cancer and their families.
Peter's role that day was to look after other people visiting from the organisation. They chose a day out at Port Arthur.
We had one team at that particular time that had developed the program. They're based in Sydney, and they actually come over to Tasmania to do their first tour here. And it so happened that that weekend they'd been here a week going around the primary schools, and they wanted to go down to Port Arthur. So I took them down there for the day.
Just 3 kilometres up the road from the tourist site, a local man, Martin Bryant, arrived at Seascape, a popular guest house run by David and Sally Martin. As people started to filter in to Port Arthur, Ian, one of the site's support staff, fielded the many vehicles packed with tourists.
I was sort of coordinating parking around lunchtime when Martin Bryant drove in.
Martin Bryant was a 28-year-old man from Newtown, Hobart. Like all the other tourists that day, Ian Kingston believed he was there to have a look around.
Didn't recognise him. He'd been around in the area when he was a kid, growing up, and he was entirely different to what he used to be, like he'd grown up and matured. When he drove in on the day, he wanted to park down near the jetty, and I pointed out to him that he couldn't do that because there was already about 8 coaches there. So he said, "Oh, can I park in front of the information centre?" And I said, "Well, it's better if you park along under the trees, under the oak trees. You want to get on the 1:30 ferry." And I said, "Well, you'll have to get a boarding pass from the information centre." He tried to get on the boat, couldn't get on. So he got back in the car and went and parked down in amongst all the coaches where we didn't want him to park anyway. I watched him do that. He sat there for half a minute. He got out of his car. On the back seat of his car he had like a golf bag type of thing, a big bag. I saw that as he drove in. Anyway, he mucked around the back seat, got this bag out, put it on his shoulder. Anyway, I didn't really take a lot of notice of it. Then he went in the boot and he was mucking around in the boot of the car. That took him a couple of minutes, fiddling with there, doing whatever he had to do. Then he walked up to the cafe.
The Broad Arrow Cafe was situated just up from the car park and the water's edge, across from the main penitentiary ruins.
He went in the front door and he was probably in there for a few minutes, might have been 10, 15, something.
As Ian continued to help other tourists, Bryant ate his meal on the deck and then went back inside. What was to happen next would change Australia forever.
And all of a sudden, I could hear this bang, bang, bang. I could see dust coming out of the building from where I was looking. And I thought, what's going on? I started to make my way up there, It's still going. I thought, God, must be a bloody electrical fault. Anyway, I ran in the building, and as I went in the door, there was one body on the doorstep, obviously shot, blood pouring out of him.
Tasmania's main tourist attraction, Port Arthur, is under siege. Ian Kingston, one of the staff members, has been helping tourists throughout the morning as the site gets busier. After hearing loud noises from the cafe, he rushes to investigate and could never have prepared for what he was confronted with.
I got inside the building and there's Bryant standing with his gun, and beside him over a bit he had his big bag that he had on his back, and I could see in the bag that there was another gun of some description.
Ian faced an unprecedented situation. Martin Bryant had opened fire with a semi-automatic weapon in the busy cafe, giving the innocent customers and staff little time to react. Peter Crosswell was also there with his party.
You can't comprehend. You're sitting on this beautiful April day, it's quite cool, sitting down for a cup of coffee, and then somebody starts coming and shooting people. It doesn't make sense.
The cafe and adjoining gift shop were crowded with more than 60 customers and staff when Bryant opened fire.
It takes time to react to it. You can't think it through, you just react to it. And some people reacted by running, other people reacted by hiding cupboards.
As the cold-blooded killer indiscriminately shot at anyone in his path, Peter made the split-second decision to try to shield his colleagues from the gunfire.
I reacted in a different way. It's not a weakness, not strength. It's just the way you react, given that. And a lot of the people that were killed were older people. They didn't have the reaction time and they were virtually shot where they were sat.
As Peter took cover and the gunman continued his rampage, Ian Kingston witnessed the horror from the doorway.
There was a person to the left of me. They went to move and he turned around and shot the guy. And then while I was there, there's a chap behind him. He got up and moved his chair and he turned around and shot two more people then. While he had his back to me, I got out.
In the space of just 90 seconds, Martin Bryant had shot and killed 20 people, injuring a further 12. As Ian rushed away from the cafe to warn others and get them to safety, some tourists hadn't yet realised a killer was on the loose.
By that time, we had a couple of coachloads of American tourists, and they thought it was just some sort of a show. And they were all flocking from out on the oval and around the whole site to see what was going on. And like I was sort of didn't know what to do.
With no signs of relenting, Bryant continued shooting in the cafe and gift shop.
I got as many as I could together in the bunch, and we started to make our way up through Government Gardens past the fountain to the parsonage. That's where I was bringing them to. It was pretty safe.
As Ian desperately gathered as many people as he could to run to safety, the gunman started to move outside, where many unwitting tourists still had no idea what was happening.
It's gunshots, live action here at Port Arthur.
I looked around and I saw him come out of the cafe, and he came out and he shot a couple of shots across over the oval towards the penitentiary.
Tourists and staff tried to take cover as the cold-blooded killer headed back towards the car park. In just seconds, he took aim at people as they ran for their lives or hid for safety on the parked vehicles. Nobody was spared. Meanwhile, Ian Kingston could see the tragedy unfold as he battled to get his group to safety.
We were bringing all these people up to the parsonage and we had the Mikacs with us. She decided she didn't want to be part of our group, it was too dangerous. She was going to leave the side. Anyway, at that point I saw him come off the bus and I said to her, stay with us, he's getting in the car. No, she said, I'm going to run up the road.
The Mikacs were a young family. Nanette and her two girls, Madeline, aged 3, and Alana, 6, visiting the site that day. Despite Ian's desperate pleas, Nanette was frantic to get her children to safety and took the decision to try and escape alone.
The Mikacs, they wanted to go home, and that was where we lost them. They just veered off and unfortunately went the wrong way.
As the family ran out of Port Arthur, Bryant also made his way off the site. He had just shot at 11 innocent people in and around the car park and jetty. The carnage and devastation left many severely wounded and others dead.
Got in the car, drove out, headed up out of the site. On the top of the site there used to be the toll booth was there where everyone paid their money. He's about halfway up and he started shooting. I thought, oh, he's probably shot the kids and all that.
Ian feared for the safety of the Mikacs. Having made the decision to leave at the same time as Bryant, they were right in his path. The gunman drove up to the family, just a few hundred meters from the exit, and stopped beside them, shooting the mother dead, before turning the gun on Madeline and Alana.
How dare someone murder two little kids after murdering their mother and chase one of them round a tree to kill her? It just beggars belief.
The enormity of the massacre was now unparalleled. A lone killer had started a callous rampage with apparently no motive. Now more than 20 people lay dead and over a dozen wounded. And the nightmare didn't appear to be ending. On seeing the brutal killings of the Mikacs, other tourists quickly hurried to get out of Bryant's path, warning anyone they could to turn back. By now, the gunman was already back in his car and making his way to the toll booth.
At that point, I heard some more shooting on top of the hill. Anyway, I rang the toll booth. Aileen was in there, and I told her, lay on the floor. She said, all the money, we're counting the money. So, and I said, don't worry about the bloody money, just get down because he's coming back. So she just laid on the floor.
Martin Bryant had in fact murdered 4 friends at their car, pulling their bodies out of the vehicle and into the road before stealing it. The killer then drove to a local service station, targeting another car that was about to leave. The couple in the vehicle had no chance to escape. The female passenger was shot as she tried to flee, whilst the man was forced at gunpoint into the boot of the stolen car. Bryant now had a hostage. An unprecedented tragedy has happened at Port Arthur in Tasmania. A lone gunman has opened fire at the popular tourist attraction, shooting innocent visitors and staff. Dozens lie dead and severely injured as the killer continues his rampage out of the site and along the road at a service station.
What happened was that after Bryant left and continued his shooting rampage up the road, you could still hear the gunshots.
And the gunfire could be heard across the site as Ian rushed to get his group away from the danger.
Yeah, the parsonage would be about 300 metres from the cafe.
On the left.
It's the longest 300 metres ever I've walked in my whole life. It was a bit of an issue to get everyone up there as quickly as we could. As the afternoon went on, the whole phone network got clogged. It was hard, and it was hard trying to pacify visitors that were here that couldn't ring out. Couldn't get a line, trying to tell people their families overseas, they're all okay.
As the survivors waited for help, Bryant was still on the loose. After taking a hostage prisoner in the boot of his car, he drove to a place he had already been to that day, Seascape Guest House. By now, emergency services had been alerted to the tragedy and were rushing to the numerous crime scenes unfolding. Terry McCarthy was a trained negotiator with Tasmania Police.
The initial call I got was extraordinarily brief. It said something along the lines of 20 dead at Port Arthur, get here now. My initial task was to try and make contact with Seascape to establish who was there and perhaps ascertain what was going on.
Whilst officers were getting into position, news of the horror was filtering through to forensic psychiatrist Ian Sale.
I heard vaguely this news flash about shootings.
At least 200 police have surrounded Port Arthur. All roads in have been blocked.
I thought, my heavens, this is happening here. I knew because I'd done occasional call-outs with the police negotiator squad. I got a telephone call from a police officer I know to ask if I could come in and lend a hand.
Information was now trickling through to Terry and Ian about the enormity of the killer's rampage. At this point, they had no idea of what to expect from this gunman. He had already callously murdered dozens of people and showed no signs of stopping.
He talked about a vehicle that was burning on the property and sort of kept asking, why aren't we doing anything about it? And it was like he'd set that fire to force police to come in to investigate what was going on. And of course, he'd set himself up to ambush those police officers should they go in there.
With a burning vehicle in front of the building, Terry had to be mindful not to rush in and put officers' lives in danger. The police also faced another challenge.
Two of my colleagues were stuck in a ditch across the road under fire, and part of my role, of course, was to keep Bryant occupied, engaged in conversation so that some sort of action could be taken to perhaps get those guys out.
The trapped officers had been the first on the scene at the guest house. Unaware of the scale of the danger, they had to take cover as he shot at them from inside the house.
It was difficult to work out exactly what weapons Bryant had. But certainly the vehicle that he'd travelled down to the historic site was subsequently located, and it was established that there were a number of weapons still in the boot of that vehicle, along with a significant quantity of ammunition. So we knew he had access to high-powered, high-capacity magazine firearms. But as to where they came from, we weren't sure at that particular stage. He was able to fire significant numbers of rounds in the general direction of police officers on the ground.
As Terry tried to get any information from Bryant, investigations were underway to try and find out who this gunman was and what possible motive he could have to cause such heartache.
Well, I'd never heard of Bryant before the day. And on the day, the information we got in, they were able to eventually identify who he was, and then they were able to identify family members. But the information that family members gave us was confusing. We were initially told that Bryant had schizophrenia, but the conversations that he was having with the police certainly didn't suggest schizophrenia, and it's not the sort of incident you would expect a person with schizophrenia to cause. But nonetheless, we were faced with that sort of information and trying to make sense of that.
With limited information on this volatile character, the police were desperate to get answers from Bryant and to try and stop any further bloodshed. But Terry McCarthy didn't receive the response he anticipated.
You're expecting a structured conversation and a belief by the other person that they have some goal that they want to achieve. Whereas we just seemed to be going through motions. It was clear that Martin Bryant really didn't have a plan. And as a consequence of that, the negotiations didn't develop in the direction that one would expect them to develop. So our focus became to establish whether there was anybody in the stronghold with him and to convince him to surrender himself without any further harm.
As the siege at the guest house appeared to be at stalemate, the hours since the initial shootings were passing by, and news of the mass killings was now spreading as medical teams desperately battled to save the victims.
It was about 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon, and my wife told me that the switchboard at the Royal had rung and that there was a major disaster.
Steve Wilkinson was head of surgical specialties at the Royal Hobart Hospital at the time.
We knew that at that stage there were going to be multiple casualties, so we formed small trauma teams. We had to clear out an entire ward of patients that were already there. We had to either send them home or move them out to other wards. We didn't know how many people were coming in. It could have been 10 or it could have been 100. We just didn't know.
With the hospital on red alert, casualties soon started arriving with varying degrees of wounds. Peter Crosswell, who had shielded his colleagues in the cafe, was taken in to be treated.
There were a couple of us, like myself and my two working mates, who got fragments of bullets and all that type of stuff.
In trying to save his friends and dodge the gunfire, Peter was shot.
The place was so sombre, as you can imagine. It was like being in a morgue in the hospital. It was shocking. But not many people stayed there for very long. I think there was 2 or 3 of us in there for 4 or 5 days.
As Peter was treated, Steve Wilkinson and his team were trying to establish the scale of everyone's wounds.
I've got to say that I've not seen injuries like that. We see gunshots and stabbings from time to time, but there is such destruction from this sort of weapon that, there's just loss of tissue. So, there was a lot of, major sort of surgery required.
Meanwhile, 95 kilometres away at Seascape guest house, the negotiation team was trying to establish if Bryant had injured anyone else inside. David and Sally Martin, the 2 owners, hadn't been seen for hours.
During those limited communications, we heard no sounds of life other than Bryant. And it's one of the reasons you have these negotiations. You're trying to work out what else is going on in their environment.
Bryant mentioned how he was preparing food for hostages, but the negotiators couldn't determine whether he was bluffing or telling the truth. And other information he was providing just didn't add up.
The way he spoke was more like a young teenager rather than an adult male. He was telling us stuff that was completely false. He said that he'd been out surfing or something like that, and it was complete nonsense. So there wasn't anything useful happening in that communication.
We didn't establish that rapport because there was no rapport to establish. He was in denial as to what had occurred in terms of he wasn't even making reference to what had occurred at the historic site. He was talking about some fanciful event that he claimed had occurred at another location at Fortescue Bay, which is also on the peninsula. was like a bad script that he was operating on.
And the situation was about to get worse.
What we weren't aware of at that particular time was that the only phone within the Seascape property was a battery-operated cordless phone. We were aware that he was using that phone, but we didn't have the knowledge that there wasn't a backup landline phone that he could pick up in the event that that went flat. So that created some problems for us when, of course, it was apparent that the battery had gone flat. The difficulty, of course, is how do you get a telephone into a situation like that safely?
After hours of attempts to get some breakthrough with Bryant, the telephone line had gone flat. They were no closer to a peaceful resolution and had no idea if the hostages were safe.
When the communications broke down, it was decided that the negotiator unit would move down to a place called Tirana, which is about 5 or 6 kilometres north of Seascape. And they set up a operations area there, and various attempts were made to try and get the communication going again with Bryant, but they were all unsuccessful. They weren't able to find a way.
As daylight broke the following morning, the killer had been holed up in the guest house for 18 hours. What happened next was to stun the officers as Bryant made his next move.
The next morning, he decided to set fire to the property.
Port Arthur in Tasmania has just experienced one of the worst human atrocities in Australian criminal history. A lone gunman, Martin Bryant, has walked into a tourist attraction with a semi-automatic gun and shot at innocent people. In an attack lasting 15 minutes, over 30 victims have been killed and dozens injured. More than 18 hours on from the tragedy, the killer is still hiding in a guest house nearby with possible hostages. Negotiators have lost communication after the phone line went flat, and whilst they try to re-establish connection, Bryant changes tack once more.
He'd set fire to Seascape and then was eventually forced out by the fire.
I'm not sure why he did that. I suspect he was trying to have police take some action. That didn't occur, of course, and as a result, I think he found it a bit difficult inside, perhaps getting himself burnt. He was arrested a short period of time later when he escaped from the house.
With Seascape in flames, emergency services rushed to the aid of any hostages that might have been inside, whilst Bryant was taken to hospital.
I personally was keeping an eye on the news, and we saw that the house that he was holed up in went up in flames and that he'd been captured, and so we knew he was coming. We wound up the burns unit to receive him, and he was brought in under pretty tight security. We gave the medical and nursing staff the option of treating him or not being involved in his treatment. He had quite significant burns, and that took a while to sort those out.
Back at the guest house, officials battling the blaze were to encounter more devastation as 3 bodies were discovered. One victim was Glenn Pears, the man he had taken hostage at the service station. The others were David and Sally Martin, the owners of Seascape.
He broke off communication at one stage and said he was going to prepare food for the hostages. But I suspect, in retrospect, that the hostages were dead by then.
Officers were to also discover that Bryant's rampage had begun before arriving at Port Arthur, visiting Seascape on the morning of the tragedy and killing the Martins. But why had he singled those out?
I believe he held a grudge against the people who ran the B&B, And that's probably where it started, that grudge. I suspect that he held them in part responsible for his father's death. The death of his father is probably the central matter. His father committed suicide in a farm dam, and the family say that he was distressed by this. I believe that he suspected that his father died because of a dispute with the people who owned Seascape. I think that's probably the heart of what happened, and it started off as revenge towards them.
Martin Bryant's father, Morris, had previously tried to buy the guest house. Yet the Martins secured it first, allegedly creating stress for the Bryant family. But if this was the catalyst in sending the gunman over the edge, why did he target all the other innocent victims too?
I think that what happened then at Broad Arrow, he expected to be stopped. He thought, just like Hollywood, that there'd be some hero with a gun there who'd cut him down. But it didn't happen. There was no one there. So this was an incident that once it got that far, he wasn't able to stop. It wasn't scripted for him. And I just think it sort of got there by accident. He didn't know what to do and just kept on going.
As Bryant was treated for his burns, Ian Sale and colleagues tried to dig deeper into his background for any insight.
They were able to retrieve his hospital record, and we learned from that he'd recently been in hospital for quite a serious injury in a motor vehicle accident, and they had noticed some oddness about his behaviour, but had been assured by family that he's got schizophrenia. We also went to the house in Newtown where he'd been living, but that was confusing too. He'd been living there with this rather eccentric woman, and the house was certainly eccentric. She was a hoarder and a collector, and that showed in the house. It was a very, very weird house, to be honest.
The woman who Bryant had lived with was Helen Harvey, a friend who had died in the car accident that injured Bryant 4 years before. Her death resulted in him inheriting a substantial amount of money.
For various reasons, he'd come into a lot of money. He was unrestrained. The people who had some degree of control over him, his father, Mrs. Harvey, with whom he lived, they were both dead. It was mayhem because he could do whatever he liked. And he did.
Bryant had in fact inherited an estate worth millions of dollars. But this didn't answer the questions now being raised on how he managed to get hold of the guns in the first place.
As far as I'm aware, Bryant bought one of his weapons through a classified ad. Another one he bought from a dealer who had a shop about 2 blocks away. No one knew that he had these weapons.
Bryant had bought an array of semi-automatic weapons with ease, no questions asked. He held no license or authorization for them. His trail of devastation had ended the lives of 35 people and caused horrific injuries to 23 victims. The number of people left affected by his crime would be too high to count. Days after the mass shooting, the country was trying to come to terms with their loss.
It shocked the nation, it shocked the world, but it really shocked Tasmania. And people were just numb, I think, for days, weeks and months after it.
I got a message from John Major, the British Prime Minister. He recalled that the massacre in Dunblane in Scotland had claimed 27 lives, and John said he never imagined that within a few weeks the number killed there would be exceeded in Australia. It was a tragedy that, as the days went by, it unnerved the country. Nobody could believe that something of this magnitude had happened in Australia. These are the sort of things that happen in other countries. They don't happen in Australia. What Port Arthur did was to bring home the fact that there were gaps in the gun laws.
The Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, made quick, decisive actions to alter the legislation that was in place on guns.
The magnitude of the tragedy in Port Arthur provided the momentum for change to occur.
The law as it stood meant automatic and semi-automatic weapons were readily available and legal to citizens across Australia, with certain laws on licensing and ownership in place.
I looked at that character and I suppose I had to think, why was it so easy for you to harm so many people? Relatively insignificant character, simple-minded, but just had access to weapons that allowed him to do a heck of a lot of damage in a very short period of time.
The laws were reasonably strict, but obviously they weren't strict enough.
By the following month, the government had made the biggest change in their weapons policy to date, bringing in the National Firearms Agreement.
The agreement was that we'd have a nationwide ban on automatic and semi-automatic weapons, and we'd have strict rules about how you looked after the guns that you're entitled to have. And then we said, well, to make it work, we've got to have a buyback. And that was part of it. And I said that the federal government would fund the buyback. Now, we bought back 750,000 guns.
I take my hat off to John Howard for doing what he did, for having the guts to stand up to the gun lobby, and as far as I'm concerned now, it ought to be a hell of a lot tougher to own a gun.
The timing was certainly right after Port Arthur, and it was the right thing to do. The way they approached it, and they gained a huge amount of support for it.
It has been successful. We've had since that legislation, if you define a mass murder or homicide as more than 5 killed in the same incident, we've not had any since then.
As people tried to rebuild their lives and readjust to the new gun laws, the fate of the man who wrecked so many lives was being sealed.
He wasn't mentally ill in the usual sense. He was fit to stand trial. He understood that he was charged and with 35 counts of murder and sundry other things. At that stage, when I met him, interviewed him at the prison, he was still denying his involvement.
We wanted to ensure that the police case or the Crown's case was so compelling and without flaw that we could successfully convict this individual for every murder that he committed.
He didn't change his mind until basically right at the end of the trial. He suddenly decided to plead guilty.
Martin Bryant's plea of guilty was accepted for all of the charges, and the Supreme Court of the day ordered 35 life sentences, and his papers were marked never to be released.
Martin Bryant was remanded in Risdon Prison, Tasmania, where he will spend the rest of his days. But despite the heartache caused, some people were intent on questioning whether he was the actual killer.
A lot of people came in afterwards, and a few of those people, for whatever motivation, came up with a different story.
They reckon, there was 2 gunmen and Wright and Bryant didn't do it and the government set him up and all this crap that was put out. It's all a load of bullshit because it was nothing like that, and I was in the middle of it, and I know exactly what happened. And I don't know where these stories originate and how they get going. It's just a load of rubbish, you know.
A poignant memorial now stands at the site where the Broad Arrow Cafe once was. A fitting tribute to all those affected by the tragedy on the 28th of April, 1996.
The memorial garden's designed for people to go there, reflect, think about things, spend their own bit of time.
The Bryant massacre just adds another layer to Port Arthur. It's horrible, it's awful, but it's not something to keep people away.
I can't help but think the best way to remember it is to recall the fact that out of this terrible tragedy, the country moved forward in gun control. And you can't remember the good without remembering the tragedy. These things are part of our history and there's no point in trying to airbrush them.
Peter Crossell now is no longer the Peter Crossell 15 seconds before Bryant started shooting. He's a totally different person, and he is a better person. And I convinced myself that was the case. So I moved forward in life with Port Arthur Massacre embellished in here and in here. End of story.
We can't just bury it, pretend it didn't happen, it didn't exist. And those people deserve more. The victims deserve more, the survivors deserve more, the families deserve more. It is part of Australian history, and I think we need to treat it as such.